Greetings in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ, and welcome to our continued study on the subject of these unchangeable apostolic truths. This time we turn to chapter 11 in our study, chapter 11, and we're going to read to begin with from Malachi chapter 3, verse 8. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And then the writings of Paul, 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 9, for ye know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that his work, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that ye through his poverty might be rich. Tithes and offerings. Do you pay your tithes? Do you give offerings? When I consider what God has done for me and the price that he paid for my salvation in that terrible sacrifice that he made that I could be saved, I wouldn't feel anything other than cheap if I should ever complain about what I give to the work of God. So why shouldn't I pay my tithes after what he did for me? Why shouldn't I pay my tithes after the sacrifice that he made for me? And why shouldn't I support the church with my offerings after what he did for me? Now, we pay our tithes because we owe it. It belongs to God. It belongs to God. We give our offerings now because this is what remains and belongs, as it were, to us, of our increase after we paid our tithes. Now, tithe means a tenth. Whether it's in Hebrew or Greek, it still means tenth. Now, mathematically, tithing is a tenth. Genesis 25:22. Scripturally, tithing is a law. Deuteronomy 12:6. And morally, tithing is a debt, Malachi 3:8. Economically, tithing is an investment, Luke 6:38, Matthew 6, verse 20. And last but not least, spiritually, tithing is a blessing. Look again to Malachi 3, verse 10, as well as Galatians 3, verse 9. Now, there are those that argue that tithing was necessarily only for those that lived under the law of Moses, that we are not in this church age subject to the law, and so we're not obligated to pay tithe today. And although tithing is indeed commanded by the law, it's also true that tithing was practiced before the law was instituted. In fact, the first mention of tithes is in the book of Genesis. Abraham, he gave tithe to Melchizedek. That's Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20. 400 years before the law was given on Mount Sinai. And also in Genesis 28, verses 19 through 22, we have Jacob. He promised to pay his tithes when he got back home. And both events took place long before the law was given and long before God ever included tithing in that law. Now, also, some argue that we shouldn't eat pork, that we should keep the Sabbath, but we don't have to pay tithe because tithing is of the law. Well, it is true that tithing is commanded by the law, but it's also true that tithing was practiced before that law was instituted. Now, the first mention of tithes in the book of Genesis is where Abraham gave those tithes or paid his tithes to Melchizedek. Now, how did Abraham or Jacob, or those that we turn to and witness, how did they know about paying tithes? Abraham came from a Chaldean, from Ur of the Chaldees, among the idolaters. How did he notice he should pay tithes? What prompted Jacob to vow to God to tithe when he returned to the land of promise? Both men either obeyed unwritten commands of God or they possessed God-given instincts that included paying tithes. There's no scriptural evidence to verify that Abel and Cain were taught about making sacrifices to God either, but they did. Again, how did they know to do it? They did. Abel's sacrifice, well, indeed was a sacrifice because he gave something that he could never replace. That is life, blood, sacrifice. Cain, on the other hand, maybe offered a head of cabbage or some carrots, I don't know. And those who tithe and also give offerings make a sacrifice of commitment. Tithing was a privilege that was practiced under the law, before the law, and after the law. When God gave the law to the people of Israel, he incorporated tithing. As with many things in the law, tithing stipulated more than the requirement of paying a mere 10% of one's income. In fact, in some instances, 1/5 or 20% was added to the tithe when certain things, shall I say, occurred that required more than just the 10%. So any of these things that were involved that would include more in their giving, their sacrifices. Now, under the law, God chose one tribe, Levi, to be his priests, to minister in the tabernacle, later in the temple. God claimed the Levites, the tribe of Levites, rather than demand the sacrifice of the firstborn males in the families of Israel. The Levites, they became God's property. They could not inherit a portion of Canaan like the rest of the other tribes did. The Levites and priests were to be supported by the tithes of the people of those 12 tribes. Numbers chapter 18, verses 20 through 24 point this out. The Israelites were commanded to bring their tithes to a place that God designated. Not just any place, they wanted to pay them. This is Deuteronomy 12, verses 5 and 6, for instance. By the time we get to Malachi, at the closing of the Old Testament, Israel had forsaken completely the paying of tithes, and there was a curse upon them. God's blessings were no longer on the nation. So Malachi, he admonished them to pay their tithes, give their offerings. And if they would do so, then God promised he'd open the windows of heaven and pour out blessings that they couldn't contain. Now, it's evident by the way that Jesus dealt with this subject, and he did in the New Testament. The familiar passage in Matthew 23, verse 23, where Jesus spoke about to the Pharisees, the scribes. Jesus didn't call them hypocrites because they paid their tithes, which they were very peculiar and minute in doing it, but because they shunned, he said, the more important matters of the law, such as judgment, mercy, and faith. And to add to it, if you will, Jesus says, these ought ye to have done and not leave the other undone. You ought to give plentifully, graciously, but you should not ignore the paying of your tithe. 1 Corinthians 12:31, Paul said, but covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet show I unto you a more excellent way. And then, beginning in chapter 13, he stated, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. Now, it's necessary to speak with tongues, but it's greater still to love. Love is the principle upon which all godly things depend. It's important to tithe, but the tithe must be an addition to all the other things of thanksgiving and appreciation in our successful walk with God that we offer to the Lord. Paul, he wrote in Galatians 3:7 that we are the children of Abraham by faith. And Genesis, again, 14:20, our father Abraham paid his tithes. And the fact that the paying of tithes was a practice in the New Testament is, I think, quite clear in the book of Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 8, where the writer of Hebrews makes the understandable statement and the plain statement, here men that die receive tithes. So that was several years after Pentecost when the book of Hebrews was written. Now, there are not long, elaborate explanations by the writer of Hebrews concerning tithing. No, that's not there. And this fact, I think by it not being emphasized like that, it also emphasizes that the practice of paying tithe by the New Testament church was common. It was something that was not unusual, but something that was usable. And usable in the walk they have with God. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul wrote to the Corinthian church concerning the support of the ministry. God's method for support of the ministry is through tithes paid by the people to the minister who serves them. And those that argue that Paul made his own living by making and selling tents, well, he did, but it would be a good thing to read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 7 through 13. Read it in regards to that. Now, it's evidently true that Paul did make tents and may not have been taken care of financially from the support from the Corinthians, but he did from other churches. And also, he instructed the Corinthian church to support the ministry, and even asked forgiveness for refusing financial support for himself when he was with them. In essence, he was, I guess we'll say, rebuking himself as well as rebuking them. Paying our tithe and giving our offerings is a blessing that cannot be received any other way. You notice that Paul, there in 2 Corinthians 9 and 7, he said, God loveth a cheerful giver. And the word cheerful in our King James Version is a translation from a Greek word, hilaris, which means merry or cheerful. And the same Greek word is also translated hilarious. It's a joy. It's a pleasure. It should make us happy to give and not begrudging it. Now, once I pay my tithes, they are no longer my responsibility. So the question is, how should tithes be used? Well, they become the responsibility of the recipient. After I've paid my tithes, they're not mine. And whoever I give them to, it's their responsibility. We should never begrudge the pastor's usage of tithes that are paid to him. In fact, if your pastor can drive a little better car and wear some nicer clothes or live in a nicer house, this should be reason for the tithe payer to be thankful and rejoice. Thank the Lord. My pastor can afford that. Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, he makes this statement: they who labor in the word and doctrine are worthy of double honor. My. Now, after Nehemiah supervised the rebuilding of the walls and restoration of Jerusalem after a long 70-year captivity of the people of Israel in Babylon, he discovered a problem. The Levites, they had been deprived of the tithes of Israel, which forced them to leave the work that they had been appointed to do and to go out into the fields to support their families. And Nehemiah makes this statement in chapter 13, verse 11. Then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Paul in 1 Timothy 5:17, he contended that they who labor in the word, as we said before, I'll repeat it, are worthy of double honor. Now, the next question, where should I pay my tithe? Where? Now, for sure, let me emphasize, for sure, you don't pay your tithes to a TV evangelist, Texas Sam or Arkansas Bill. Try calling one of them when you need prayer or you need a visit in the hospital at midnight. Try calling Texas Sam or Arkansas Bill. They wouldn't know. They wouldn't do it if they could. And yet they'll continually plead for an offering or a portion of your tithe. And well, it's absolutely and totally wrong to pay a portion of my tithe anywhere other than where it belongs. If a portion is taken from my tithe, then it's not really tithe, because tithe means a tenth, not a portion of 10, but 10. You should pay your tithes in the place where you receive your spiritual benefit and nourishment for your spirit and your soul, which belongs to your local church and pastor. Your pastor's ministers holy things to you, and in turn should be sustained by the things of the house of God, the partaking of things that you bring to the house of God, the paying of your tithes. A man that cares for his flock, and a man ready going to war for you. Support your pastor, God will bless you. Pay your tithe, and God will bless you. Give your offerings freely, and God will bless you. Now, next question. What is my tithe? Your tithe is 10%. Don't be cheap when it comes to paying your tithe. If you made $100, you pay 10%, $10. And I know there are, I guess we say, differences in a way, if I can say it that way. Some people are not on salary, are not on a given amount of income, such as farmers and contractors and whatever. And they must decide what their net is and pay the tithes on their net. The book of Malachi considered those who lived under the law, and they had refused to pay their tithes, and he called them robbers of God. So what should people who refuse to tithe in this day of God's grace, what should they be considered or called? Haggai said about those that put their money in a bag that's got holes in it. Chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. Paying your tithe is one way of watering, if you will, laying up treasures in heaven and measuring out the good things of God, that for whatever you measure or mete out will come back to you, according to Jesus, Luke 6:38. Now, you and your finances, nothing is probably more frustrating to a family relationship than finances, or a church as far as that's concerned. But there are probably more arguments, more harsh words, and more bad feelings over the subject of money than any other subject in marriages. Paul referred to the fact that he said the love of money is the root of all evil. 1 Timothy 6:10. The slow pace of our fathers and grandfathers have been replaced by the computer pace of this generation. So it's difficult to keep up with the pace we find ourselves faced with today. Married couples are confronted by a cold world of reality that dictates, and nowadays, both have got to pay. Mom and dad, husband, wife, and that's sad. Would to God that it was not like that. It is only natural that we should have a desire to give something to God after He has given so much to us. Now that we've become children of God, we should direct our financial attention toward His work. The church can function only upon the liberality of its members. The ministry in the church could not function properly if it were not for those that pay their tithes and give of their support to the work of God. And then there's the matter of our offerings. You know, the tabernacle was built upon offerings. In Exodus 25, we find that. In fact, they gave so much, the people of Israel did, that Moses finally told them, stop, don't give any more. We've got enough. Wouldn't that be great for every pastor to be able to say that? Now, again, when the time to build the temple, the tabernacle, and later they would build the temple, the same is involved, joining together. Now, look at the results of the people's giving as recorded. The people were told of the need. They were informed of the purpose of their offerings. They brought it willingly. There was no pressure placed upon them. They gave willingly of their substance, and they gave more than enough to build that tabernacle. Now, we may feel our obligation to pay our tithes, and we may feel and fail to attach to it, that feeling, the same importance to give offerings to the work of God. And usually those who are faithful with their tithes will be faithful with offerings as well. We pay tithe because God blesses us with income. And again, what we're paying, we're giving it to God and the work because it's His portion. We give it willingly, our offerings, because God blesses us with extra resources after our tithe has been paid. The sacrifices the children of Israel brought to the Lord, I think, are good examples of how we should look at our offerings to the work of God. Now, often, out of habit, we continue to give the same amount of offerings that we gave 20 years ago. You know, good old George is still being passed out. But you're making no telling how much more percentage in income than when you were first giving that dollar bill. Our investment in the work of God is the wisest investment that we can ever make. If we give in comparison to the increase of our income through the years, don't you think we ought to be giving more than a dollar bill? Someone that makes $1,000 per week and gave 5% of that income as offering to the work of God would only give $50 per week. But imagine how that would accumulate if everyone did it. Now, I'm not saying 5% is the level of offerings, but I'm just giving an idea. So many times the pastor gets blamed for talking too much about money. You know, Jesus spoke about money in some manner about 2 out of every 3 times he taught. Quite often. quite often. Now, Jesus, he revealed two important things about our offerings. That if we give, it shall be given to us. We receive the same degree that we give. If we give little, well, we'll receive little. And so Paul put it this way, 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give. Not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. Sounds like we need to be shouting or laughing when we pay our tithes and give our offerings. Giving should not be approached in a grudging manner, but rather done with a joyful heart. Give freely, give openly, give joyously, give hilariously. Amen. The rich cast of their abundance, that little widow woman, you read about in the book of Luke 21, she gave of her living. All the living that she had, in fact, Luke calls it in verse 4 of chapter 21. Now, one area which is also neglected when it comes to giving is our time. How much time do we give to the Lord out of our week? If we attended every service during the week, we'd only spend, 5-6 hours in church? If we gave the Lord tithes of our time during the week, well, we'd give him at least 16 hours weekly. There are tremendous blessings to be known in some way, in some manner, by what we do physically. There are a lot of ways. Well, one way we can pay, if you will, or give back to what we have been given is pray. Pray for the church. Pray for your pastor. Pray for all the assistants of those involved in leadership capacities. Pray for missionaries. Pray for your neighbors. Pray for loved ones. Pray for enemies. Pray for revival. Another way that you can give is to visit the elderly. Would be by a cheerful visit. The sick would be blessed. Another way, witness. Be an example. Talk to people in your community. Invite them to church. That's giving of your time. And work? Well, there are several things that can be done around most churches and do the work willingly, freely. And then 1 Chronicles 28 in verse 9 said, serve him with a perfect heart and a willing mind. Willing minds. And then there are willing hands. There shall be with thee for all manner of workmanship, every willing, skillful man for any manner of service. And then there are willing workers who then is willing to consecrate his service this day unto the Lord. And again, let's go back to Paul's writings again. In 2 Corinthians 8:12, Paul said, for if there be first a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. A willing mind. If you can sing a solo, sing in the choir or chorale, can't play music, or can't give large offerings, or pay great sums in tithes, maybe you can't teach a Sunday school class, that you can still give of your time to the work of the Lord and receive bountiful blessings and benefits. There are so many ways. I've just scratched the surfaces. There are so many ways we can give our offerings. There's, different ways we can pay our tithes too, I suppose, 10%. You can tithe your time as well as your income. You can give of the time as well as of your finances. It's all to the Lord. And we work together that the work of God may move forward in a positive manner and be fruitful in doing so. Thank you for sharing with me in our study Let's pay our tithes this week. Let's give our offering this week. God bless you.